Welcome to another museum FAQ video. I'm Paul Orselli, President and Chief Instigator at POW, Paul Orselli Workshop here on Long Island. And our topic is so interesting and important today. We don't have just one guest, we have two guests, and I'm delighted to welcome both Avis Decter and Ken Yellis today. Hi guys, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you for having us, Paul.
Sure, happy to have you here. So I always like to ask the guests first to just give us a brief sense of their background. And so let's do that today before we roll into the main conversation. Avi, can you tell us a little bit about your background first, and then we'll hear about Ken's background too.
Sure. At this point, I'm now entering my 50th year of involvement with museums, going back to when I was a very small child. In 1972, I had the opportunity to become an adjunct researcher at the St. Mary's City Commission in Southern Maryland, which is now historic St. Mary's City, a major outdoor museum of archaeology. I have ended up as a senior person at a number of museums, large and small, including the Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia, the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, Winter Tour, and then I did 18 years of full-time consulting work as an interpretive planner and program developer. As luck would have it, one of my early planning projects was the Jewish Museum of Maryland in Baltimore. And 18 years after planning that museum, I went back to it as an executive director for 13 years. So sort of an odd gift to myself, as it were. But I had a wonderful time there for 13 years and then retired in 12 and have been a professional kibitzer ever since. A lot of it in the museum field.
Well, that's great. Thank you. And Ken, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background too?
Well, it's interesting because Avi's background and mine are almost in synchronous chronology. I mean, I entered the museum field in 1973 as an intern at the National Portrait Gallery, where I wound up working for 14 years. In 4 different jobs. Started out as an intern, and then I was in the Office of Small Exhibits, which was my idea. And it was actually my idea of a perfect job. And I did that for a couple of years. Then I moved over to the education department as associate curator of education, and then curator of education for 9 years. And I've been at Plymouth Plantation, and I've been at the Peabody Museum of Natural History in New Haven, and I've been at the International Tennis Hall of Fame. And I've been at Touro Synagogue for, well, that was just less than a year. And like Avi, I've been a freelance. I've done a lot of consulting. I've done a lot of content development for exhibitions and other projects, and I've done a lot of grant writing, which I really like, much to my surprise. I just saw it as another form of storytelling, and when I saw that you're telling a story, that's something that I and everybody in my family, going back time out of mind, has been trained to do, and it's just another facet. I don't consider myself retired. I'm in fact very much emotionally and I think spiritually and intellectually engaged with the museum world. And what's interesting about this year for me is that up until the pandemic, I had never really thought in a dedicated, consistent way about the future of museums. I always took the future of museums as, at some level, something that could be taken for granted. To see them thrust into jeopardy, as they have been over the last little bit more than a year, was shocking. And it felt like a call to, I don't know, kind of a call to engage myself in thinking about that future. And as a result, one of the outcomes of that was Avi was going through a similar process, I think. And so we started writing blogs about the future of museums. And that was one thing that led to the next, and then the next, and one of the next was the manifesto.
Well, that's a perfect segue, because I'm sure we could have rich conversations about both your individual and collective experiences at all the interesting organizations you've worked at. But we want to focus on the manifesto, because, and that's an interesting word to use, because you often think of manifestos being associated with big historic events. And I think this is a big historic event related to the notion of the future of museums and these multiple issues crashing together, racial equality, museum work and pay, pandemics and plagues. This is the perfect storm, although not necessarily. Well, we'll see. We'll talk about that. So you and Avi have written a manifesto, which I think is both a call to action and actually I find it a hopeful document, honestly. So we want to talk a little bit about that today. And I'll just mention, since we are in YouTube land, that we will give links to the manifesto and information about Ken and Avi and any references and links that we talk about today. But let's talk just a little bit in general about the notion of your manifesto, your collective manifesto. Like, after all these years of working and engaging with the museum business, why did you write a manifesto?
Avi, you want to take that, or you want me to take
He's
it?
giving you the hard one.
No, not at all. The pandemic is really a shorthand for a whole series of nested crises. Certainly there was the plague, which we've all had to contend with in this country and globally. But much beyond that, we've had economic disruption, social protest, political division, and a growing concern with the environment and its degradation, all linked one to another. They're really not very separable items. So in the face of all of that, museums, for the most part, were forced to close. In many cases for a year or even longer. Some had shorter durations of closure, but many did close. And that threw into high relief a lot of the assumptions that we had been making about museums and how they work and what their future would look like. Those questions really ran from what are all these unemployed museum people going to do with their lives now, to how will these museums reconstitute themselves once they're reopening. It was very clear that all of the conditions that we had assumed to be continuous and consistent were not any longer. The words upheaval and disruption occurred to us with regularity. And our sense was that we had two choices. We could look at this as a disaster, wring our hands, and do not much of anything. Or we could take the opportunity to reflect in a positive way about the kinds of changes that could occur if we put our minds to it. And I guess our conviction was that the thing that museum profession as a field has done the least of is reflection. It's odd because there are tons of books about museum practice, but there are not an awful lot of books about, the ultimate purposes of museums out there in the world. And that requires a certain amount of attention. And certainly within individual museums, most of the time, people don't really stop and reflect in a serious way. Closest they come to it is every 5 years, they look at a strategic plan and think briefly about the mission And after that, done and over. But the pandemic really called for more serious reflection about where we were going and why.
This was the universe pressing the pause button, whether we liked it or not.
Well, it's interesting that you say that. One of the blogs that we wrote picked up on Albert Camus' The Plague, and which seemed like a very apt thing to be thinking about in the middle of the pandemic, or the early stages of the pandemic. One of the things that Camus gets at in the book is the way pandemics or epidemics or plagues strip away the veneer of civility from society and reveal the underlying fault lines and fissures. And it became clear to us that that was exactly what was going on in the museum world through these meetings that we convened, and other seminars and Zoom meetings that we sat on. We could hear a lot of pain in people's voices and in their descriptions of what was going on. And the pain had to do with the problems that were sort of, as we were talking about earlier, festering in the museum world that had never been systematically addressed. And I think the absence of reflection is actually symptom of a lot of the fault lines within the museum field. We don't want to think about this, because if we think about it, it's going to cause us to change something. It's going to force us to change how we manage. It's going to force us to think about how we allocate resources. It's going to force us to try to seek out audiences among people whom we don't understand and are not particularly well connected to. There were a lot of problems out there, and people were really in kind of an emotional tension that didn't seem to be going away. And I think that the manifesto grew out of those responses, the meetings that we convened, the meetings that we sat in on, and what we were hearing about the problems that people saw in the museum world, and the fact that these problems were well documented. They've been going back decades and decades. It's not like this was a new complaint. I'll stop.
No, that's all right. I'm gonna ask you to start up in a slightly different mode, because in your manifesto you both articulate several themes or areas of concern that you'd like people to focus on and touch on. And I'd like actually each of you maybe to just touch on one of those, because I'll just say again, we'll include links to the manifesto, but it's worth reading carefully. And rather than whizzing through it in a sort of video format, I'd like to give people maybe a teaser and have each of you touch on just two aspects of the broader manifesto. And so actually, Ken, I'd be interested, since what you were just talking about might be a segue into the notion of disruptions. And so maybe you can talk a little bit, you can triangulate some of the things that you and Avi wrote about in the manifesto, but focus in a little bit or narrow down a little bit on the sort of issue related, the challenges inherent with disruptions.
Well, yeah, there are a number of things in the manifesto that relate to this. I mean, one of the things that was actually sort of shocking was the number of times in these conversations that we were having in people, you would hear people talk about the really dramatic disconnect between the sort of humane or humanities values that museums are supposed to represent and advocate for, and the way people are actually treated in those environments. And there was a lot of symptomology, to use an ugly word, that talks about how, in effect, institutions apparently can be hypocritical. They can seem to be advocating for some values and intentions, but their behavior is often very different. And this comes up again and again in the conversations that we were having, and the anguish that that produces in people's lives, and the failure of museums to take the people who work for them and work with them, their contractors, the vendors that they deal with, the people they commission to do projects, whatever. They treat them really badly. Why is that? Is it because they're just resource scarce, or because they disconnect the task from the lives of the people whose job it is to execute those tasks? So
I was going to say it rings a little hollow when you read about a museum's commitment to education in their mission statement, when they are laying off wholesale all their contract educators in one fell swoop. It's like, wait, this is in the first sentence of your mission statement. What just happened here? How does that relate to each other? So yeah, I agree. That's very disturbing.
Yeah, another example of that is the relationship of museums to their communities. I mean, one of the first things that a lot of museums did, I think notoriously MoMA, but there were others as well, the first thing they did was sort of furlough or lay off their frontline people, the educators and the volunteers, the docents, and all of your possible connections to the community around you were just, they're at sea. They're in lifeboats, and there's a hole in the lifeboats. So there's something wrong. And there are a lot of examples that could be pointed out, and they're all sort of diagnostic of the fact that there is a fault line, there's a fissure under the surface for all of what museums do. And we're not the only institutions that are guilty of that kind of behavior, but it's really, really kind of shocking. I yield the floor to Avi.
Yeah, no, well, that's perfect because as I said at the beginning, while the manifesto certainly articulates challenges and issues, it's not just a litany of woes. There really is a hopeful aspect to that, and maybe one particular way is this notion of next practice instead of best practice, next practice. So I will yield the floor also to Avi, and maybe Avi, you could spend a little time talking about what the notion of next practice means to you and means in the context of the manifesto.
Sure. It's I think that we should actually begin with the fundamental thesis of our manifesto, and that is that the upheavals and disruptions that we've experienced in the last 15 months or so are really an opportunity. And the opportunity that we see is next practice. So what do we mean by next practice? If you are operating in conditions that are absolutely unprecedented in your experience and the experience of almost everyone else in the field, probably everyone in the field, then looking to the tried and true is not going to get you very far. There's a wonderful comment, although I think it was Veblen who said it, although nobody's ever pinned it down, that if you keep on doing the same thing under changed conditions and expect different results, you're going to be awfully disappointed. So simply doing what we have been doing under these unprecedented conditions, these conditions of what we could call novelty, means that we've got to find a new way of doing things. Basically, we've got to adapt to novelty. And that means we have to rethink our fundamental purposes. We need to rethink our structures. We need to rethink our policies. We need to rethink our relationships, both internal and with our communities of service. Now, that's a tall order for a field.
I was going to say, just a small list that you have there.
Right. But you know, there are some advantages to reflection. One of them is it doesn't cost an awful lot. There are very few things in the museum practice that come free of charge. And reflection simply takes a little time and a lot of intentionality. So our argument basically is that we are past time on a whole range of issues that Ken alluded to, that have been out there for decades in many cases, that are now receiving new attention and new focus. So this is a perfect opportunity for us to really hone in our thinking on it. It is very hard to achieve an alternative reality unless you can imagine an alternative reality. So the first step in the process is to think hard about where you are and some of the changes that you're going to have to make to get to a new reality. I'd like to point out, by the way, that museums are in fact changing quite rapidly right in front of our eyes. There's been a turn to digital, which, if not universal, has certainly been a hallmark for most museums in this country already. There's now been a turn to community in response to the social upheavals that we are experiencing around ourselves. There's been a turn to new paradigms that link social and environmental justice. And these things are inescapable. It doesn't matter whether you're on the left or the right, whether you're a moderate or an immoderate person. The bottom line is that these things are universal conditions under which we are operating. And they force us to think hard about what's going to happen. One of the things that's going on that we don't pay enough attention to is we see a big change, we give it a name, and we forget about it. But in fact, there are direct implications for what happens to people in institutions when those changes occur. With the closure of museums, a lot of places fired and furloughed an awful lot of people. And we say, gosh, that was terrible. And we stop right there. Well, we have to start thinking about it a little more. If you look a little more deeply, you can see that one of the things that happened is that in a lot of museums, that flattened the structure of the museum. Middle managers disappeared, departments got consolidated. That changes the very structure of the hierarchy within the museum. Suddenly, when the turn to digital, guess who's conversant in digital? It's the younger members of the staff, the more junior members of the staff who speak the language and can walk the walk. The result is that a whole new generation of voices in a lot of these museums are being heard at the highest levels of authority in the museum for the very first time, because they're the people who have the keys to the kingdom. If you're a senior manager who can't manage a Zoom conversation on your own, you start paying really serious attention to somebody who knows how to handle social media. So we're watching generational shifts within the museum, and all of these things are obscured by the sort of, oh my God, the world is coming to an end. The world is not coming to an end, but it is changing. And that, I think, and I'll pass this back to you, Paul and Ken, change is the hardest thing for people to embrace.
Change can be difficult. Absolutely. I just wanted to pick up on one topic that you just touched on, Avi, which I think is another aspect of people being furloughed and sort of the uneven demographic distribution of the people, many people who lost their jobs. When you would like to have a more varied demographic within your museum, many front of house and educators who lost their jobs were younger people and people of color. And so if the music, again, goes back to, wait a second, you want to reach your communities, and maybe one of the ways you want to do that is by representation and digital, people who are familiar with digital tools. You just laid off a whole bunch of those people. So that, I think that's a challenge too here. Well, I think we have certainly touched on challenges and some of the two of the big issues that, as both of you have articulated, are interlocking issues that really can't be sort of segregated or put into individual boxes. They really do relate to each other. These are intersectional issues. I would like to put you each on the spot, because that's what I get to do as being the convener of the conversation. But, you know, we talked about some difficult things and some challenges, but I've mentioned several times, and each of you have, there were glimmers of hope in in the things that you spoke about. I'm just wondering, you know, here somebody might be watching this video and thinking, well, I'm not the director of a museum. I'm not a gigantic philanthropic funder. What can I do if I am a front of the house person, if I am a new museum studies graduate, if I am an independent museum professional, either by choice or now I've been forced to become an independent museum professional because my job disappeared in the museum I was working at. What is one thing that each of you might suggest to people across the org chart, across the demographics of, I'm going to call them broadly museum workers, whether they are currently employed in a museum or not, people who care about the future of museums? What's one thing each of you would like people to think about in a hopeful way, not a Pollyanna-ish way, not a, oh yeah, everything's going to be sweetness and light, but just something that people can grab onto and say, you know, that is something I could work on. That is something that I could meaningfully contribute to the better future of museums. I've given you each a small task, but I've also given you an opportunity to think about that in my lead up here. So maybe Ken, if you could take us away, and then Avi, you could take us out.
I don't know, Paul. This is going to take a couple of days to talk through.
We'll link to a separate YouTube video where you give us a multi-day soliloquy, but I'm giving you the opportunity for the highlights now.
I think actually several of the words that have come up just in the last few minutes among the three of us really are part of what you're talking about. I think I want to get back to the concept of reflection for a minute. I think we tend to think of reflection as something people do after they've had an experience and they kind of have to come to terms with it. But there's another way to think about it, and hopefully it's a way that will become a little bit more present in the museum community than it typically is. Reflection is a kind of discipline. It's part of your responsibility as a manager and as a supervisor and as a creative person to think about what just happened and what it tells you about the landscape around you, and kind of what works, what has meaning, what kind of connects to people, what can we do that's different about the way we think about our tasks that would make our work kind of more durable and more durable over time. And I think that and I actually write about this, as Avi knows. There's this book that I've been struggling with for several centuries, and reflection is one of the themes within it. There's another, which Avi was talking about, the role of imagination in all of this. We know that the landscape is blasting. We know that the economy is in shambles. We know that our social organization is crumbling, and our relationships with each other are very, I don't know, vulnerable and fragile and maybe dangerous in various ways. There's a lot that's wrong out there. So part of the challenge for any of us, not just museum people, not just young museum people, was what would have to change to sort of detoxify the environment in which we find ourselves. And if we can think about what might change that could contribute to that, what's the role of museums in that? How can museums be a positive force in social reintegration and building a more benign and constructive social environment? There's work that we can do in terms of processing what we witness and what we experience that can help us build on what needs to happen to get to a better place as a society. America is a very sick country. I don't know if you've noticed this, but it's not doing well. What will it take to heal it? You know, and is there a role for museums in healing?
Well, I love that actually you mentioned two powerful tools, reflection and imagination, that are certainly germane to this conversation. And so, Avis, since Ken has given us reflection and imagination as potential tools to help the museum business and maybe broader society move forward, what might be a tool or two that you would like to highlight as we close out?
This directly ties to reflection. I think that one of the things that we've seen is that there's been an absolute flourishing of networking across the field, thanks to Zoom and other platforms. We have online encountered literally dozens of colleagues from every part of the country at all stages of their career, people still in graduate school, to people like us who are already fourth generation museum professionals. And all of these people are sharing their concerns, and they're also sharing possibilities for change. I think that the critical task that each one of us can undertake is that, aside from reflecting and aside from imagining an alternative reality, we can also begin to push, however gently, for experiments, for innovations, for new possibilities within our workplace. Institutions are surprisingly porous, and even people at the lowest rungs of hierarchies, even people whose voices are usually stifled or ignored, have in fact a great deal of play in an institution. And I think that the critical thing for us is to see these folks put out their views as forcefully as they need to, as carefully as they need to, but to push for trying a new way. There's always another way. There's always another alternative. And if there's a single thing that we know for sure about where our museums are today, they're in a place where they need to be messy and experimental and try new stuff. If we take it as a legitimate kind of experimentation, there is never a failure. Whatever you're trying, as long as you're monitoring carefully, will teach you something. Even if that something is, don't ever do that again, or at any rate, don't ever do it in the same way again. But mostly, people are surprised when they try new ways of doing things. In fact, what often happens is that we surprise ourselves and we discover that the damn newfangled thing actually works. And we can change ourselves, we can change our practice, eventually the institutional policy, and finally the institutional structures and make a difference. So I think every single individual has to take personal responsibility for instituting change in his or her professional life.
It's a tough act to follow. I don't know.
Well, both of you are a tough act to follow, but I don't need to follow it because I'll just direct people to the manifesto. But what you both said just struck two thoughts in my head here. One is, I often say to people, since I primarily focus on exhibits, that there's never just one right way to, to make an exhibit. You know, there's lots of different ways. But I think also something that Avi, you touched on, and Ken also in your remarks touched on, I think across my career and experiences in the museum, one thing that has always struck me as a tremendous strength of the museum business is people's capacity to share with each other professionally. And if somebody came up with a great idea that they could share and somebody could do in a different way at another institution, I think there's a tremendous value to that, and maybe more so now than ever. So I think I really encourage everyone to check out the manifesto and the references and links that we will provide below. And I really thank you both for a very thoughtful, and I'll just say again, hopeful conversation. Both Ken and Avi, I really appreciate you taking the time today.
Well, the manifesto is optimistic. I think it's very, it is positive in its goals, and I, you know, just picking up on what Avi was talking about a minute ago, I think one of the reasons for experimentation and reinvention is that when you start to do something, you can't specify all the possible outcomes. You only know the ones that you've seen before. The advantage of experimentation is that it can reveal new outcomes to you, and the bonus from that, the positive payoff from that, can be really, really powerful. We think that this is a project. This is a project that the whole museum community can engage in, and we need them to, because there's a lot that has to be worked on, and it's a big ask. I think the other thing that's going on is that, and I just lost my thought. Avi did that the other day. I think that there is a missing piece in how America tells its stories about itself. There's a missing structure there somewhere. And I think one of the things that museums have the potential to do is to take ownership and custody of that story. Because if America is going to be healed, that's going to be part of how that happens, if it can happen at all.
Wow. Well, I want to visit more museums like that for sure.
Yeah, name three.
You know, the fact is that these changes are already happening in museums large and small around the country. I'm from a Philadelphian, and the Philadelphia Museum of Art just opened up a sequence of new galleries in its main building, in which they installed not one, but two different exhibitions that really speak to the future. One of them was the galleries of American art up to 1850. And for the first time, they're acknowledging the influence of African Americans, of Latinos, of the Chinese, if you can picture this, on the evolution of art in America before the Civil War. This is a global interpretation that has never been seen before in that museum under any circumstances. And in a new special exhibition gallery, they have just mounted a show of 30 Philadelphia artists, contemporary artists. They have never done anything quite like that before either. These speak very powerfully to the changes that are afoot, even in fairly conservative institutions, And I'd like to remind you that Philadelphia was one of those major museums this past year which voted in a union because of grievances about workplace inequities, abuse, and what have you. So here's an institution which by its very nature is very hierarchical, extremely structured in a traditional fashion, and yet they have in their public program taken 2 giant steps that they have never taken previously. I think there's every reason to hope that these changes will continue.
Well, I think that's a great way to end our conversation today. Again, on a hopeful note. Well, again, many thanks, Ken and Avi. I really appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, really, this has been interesting and fun. Thanks, Paul.
That's good. Take care.